All right, welcome back. So today I'm going to continue the series about responsibilities of a professional racket stringer. So today I'm going to dive deeper into the stringing rackets part of the presentation. So really, when you look at all 14 of these components, I plan on making a video on each of those. So on my first video, it was kind of an overview of the responsibilities of the professional racket stringer and what that looks like. And today we're going to dive deeper into stringing rackets specifically. So please make sure that you watch the first video if you hadn't had a chance, and there's going to be subsequent episodes as well. All right, let's get into it. So, first off, preparation when you're installing the strings. So, begin by thoroughly inspecting the racket frame for any signs of damage, such as cracks or weakening grommets. This could, really affect the stringing, and check for any distortions or structural issues that might compromise the racket's performance. And so, this is basically what, when I take a racket in, I will make sure that I take a look all the way around the hoop, and I look at the areas where uh, there potentially could be issues. Just general, usually around 10 and 2 o'clock. That's where a lot of rackets seem to hit the pavement and hit the court. And then from there, I kind of look around from stringing. Sometimes, uh, different stringers create stress fractures from that as well. So I'll just kind of look all the way around just to make sure. And if there is a problem, I will make sure that I tell that to my customer, because I don't want to end up stringing the racket and afterwards going, oh, by the way, you had a crack. Sometimes, if you also sell rackets, it's an opportunity to sell rackets. Otherwise, it's an opportunity just to talk to your client about, potentially what stringing the racket with some type of crack or breakage, what that might end up doing. And then, of course, always clean the racket, man. I like to clean the racket each time after I cut out the strings, removing any of the dirt or the debris, especially if they play on clay or it's been, if it's hit the dirt or just been sitting around, the dust and so forth, and any little scuff marks and so forth. So I'll get some rubbing alcohol, a rag, and I'll just kind of go around and really clean that. Most everybody definitely appreciates that. So that's the first part in prepping the racket, inspecting and cleaning. All right, next up, removing the old strings. So again, generally I will clean the racket before. I'll clean the racket actually after I take the strings out. But nonetheless, get a string cutter. Using scissors or small clippers makes it a little bit more difficult. So I prefer, the gardening shears, or you can get specific tennis cutting scissors. It makes it a lot quicker. And then, of course, there are ways to do it efficiently and do it without creating frame distortion. Because when you think about all of the tension that is put on each of the strings, and when you have about 40 strings on a racket and each of them strung at those pounds, that creates a lot of potential where if leave a racket with a broken string in it, how over time that could create a problem. So I generally will go from the center out, and there are videos on how to do that efficiently, but you want to be aware of that. Next thing, removing the strings from the grommets. So gently, you don't want to just start ripping them out, because the places where there's knots, you could potentially damage the grommets. And if the grommets are already a little brittle, you could potentially damage those even more. And that's also a good time to be looking at the grommets. You can kind of look at them as you do that, as you take the string out. So generally, once I have them all cut, I'll go ahead and start pulling them out individually. And many times when there is a knot, sometimes you do have to do a little extra work around that. But yeah, just be careful when you take the strings out so that you don't potentially damage any of the grommets and stuff. I know we sometimes tend to just want to yank them out. Sometimes, if you don't do it right, the grommets start coming out, right? They start to unseat. And if they've been seated in that racket for a while, you might have a little trouble getting them back in. So just a note for those who haven't had a lot of experience with that. All right, next up, measuring and cutting the new strings. So, measuring the appropriate length for your racket is important, right? Most sets come in either 38 to 40 feet. Of course, if you're stringing off of a reel, you don't want to waste string because there's, ways that you could save a little bit by buying reels, and that's kind of one reason why you buy reels. So, what you want to do, for tennis specifically, it's about 38 feet. Some rackets maybe, need 39 feet. If you're It's also going to depend, if you're stringing a two piece or a one piece. You can do a measurement to know what you need, or you can look up the specs of the racket and they could tell you how much you need. But generally, you're pretty safe with 38 feet. Now, badminton is around 33 feet, and squash is around 30 feet. And so, it's important to know that. And it is good to kind of cross over and just start learning about some of these other sports. If you only string, let's say, tennis rackets, and you are thinking about expanding one of these other areas and start getting familiar with stringing and gauges and all that with the other sports as well. Precision cutting. Cut the string from the reel using a sharp string cutter to ensure a clean cut that will not fray or split during stringing. Precise measuring and cutting help avoid wastage and ensure you have adequate length for knot tying. Yeah, this is very important because what will happen is, like, if you just cut it straight off, then you're going to still have to cut it again when you want to create an angle. And the idea is to create a sharp angle, not one that's so sharp that it's going to, like, cut into you, but you want to create a good solish angle so that when you're weaving, it's easier to weave and stuff. So you can do that at the time that you're actually cutting the strings off of the reel, or if you're cutting the strings into. Next up, oh, I'm sorry. Let's see. I went a little bit ahead of where I wanted to be. All right, so two-piece stringing. Okay, so let's get into stringing patterns a little bit. So the first that I do like to look at is the two-piece stringing. So this is where you use two strings, one for the mains and one for the crosses, and it kind of allows you to try different strings, different gauges, and of course different tensions because you are going to be tying each off individually. So there'll be four knots on the racket actually. So this allows you to do more customizing with your rackets. And so I like to look at this in the sense that you can really alter this string tension by maybe 5 pounds, or you can try different gauges or different strings. So if you're customizing, this is probably the way to go. Um, and sometimes you can try different things and so forth. So okay, next up is one piece string. So of course that's a continuous string, and so you're basically just going to be having two knots, starting knot and tie off knot. It sometimes this could be quicker, and some I guess the idea of does it um, is it more consistent with string maintenance and string tension maintenance because there's only two knots? Well, if you tie knots really well and you it doesn't really matter. I think some people who can tie knots better so that they don't lose tension can do better on a two piece as far as maintaining the tension. But if you're starting out, doing a one piece, as long as you kind of know how to do top down and so forth. And some of your clients will actually ask that you do a two piece or that you specifically do it one piece, so forth. So it's kind of good to keep that in mind. And so when you are doing that one piece stringing, sometimes you do what's called around the world. So basically, what that means is you will. The idea is to always string a racket from the top down. Historically, that's always been the case. Rackets are made a little bit differently now. They might not. Most rackets are not going to be as sensitive to starting at the throat and stringing up when you're stringing the crosses, but it's still a good practice and many people do still prefer to have it go from top down. So you would basically do the around the world pattern on a racket where the mains end up on the bottom of the racket. So basically, what you're doing is on the short side, you will not string the last one, and then on the long side, when you're down at the throat, and you would basically come across on the first cross on the bottom, and then you'd come back up, and then you go down. That's like the traditional around the world pattern, and so forth. And of course, that is generally what you would do with a one piece stringing in that case. It doesn't occur when you're doing two piece stringing. So just keep that in mind. Fan patterns. Okay, that particularly would be something that squash rackets and racquetball rackets tend to have more of, and that's kind of based on, like, think of a fan, right? It's tighter at the bottom, and it kind of goes fans out, and so sometimes that takes a little bit more effort, and you really want to look at how that's done. Sometimes when you're stringing those rackets and they're basically um, on one part of the frame on the bottom or so forth, you really have to, kind of be careful and distribute those strings evenly and so forth. So that is what you would consider stringing with a fan pattern. Only really applies to those other sports, not usually tennis. There are some tennis rackets that would have that, but we don't see that much anymore. Okay, tension setting. Player preference, of course, set the desired tension on the stringing machine based on what the player wants, and the playing style. Higher tensions generally offer more control, while lower tensions provide more power and a softer feel. And so the idea behind that is, think about the tighter that you create the string bed, um, the more control you have where that ball bounces, because it's not going to be as a trampolining kind of effect, right? But the looser it is, the more that it could pocket, and then there's more opportunity for it to maybe have some off shots, or also not have quite the control that you have, but you have a little bit more power because it kind of um, projects it a little bit more. And as far as specific tensions, it is good to know the general range for each of the different sports. So, for tennis, generally most of the rackets are going to be somewhere between 50 to 70 pounds. And of course, nowadays, with a lot of poly strings going at a lower tension, that might also be the case. Badminton rackets generally go between 18 to 30 pounds, and squash rackets between 20 to 30 pounds in general. So it is good to know that, so that you don't get in there and go, yeah, I'm going to string this badminton racket at 50 pounds. You know, it's just that once you learn a little bit more about the sports, and then you can really start talking a little bit with your clients on their needs a little bit more and help them out on that. So this is where you really want to understand tensions and strings, and also the racket, whether it's a mid-size or oversized and so forth. Um, Consistent tensioning. That's why, pulling evenly, uniformly each time, having the same amount on each side when you're pulling strings. So when you're pulling the mains, be consistent. Pull four on one side, four on the other, and so forth, so that, number one, it doesn't distort your racket, and also the string tension will be more uniform that way as well. And make sure that with your machine that you keep it calibrated, whether it's a drop weight, check that out. It's harder to calibrate a drop weight, but as far as the constant pull, and then also the lockout machines, those are ones that you definitely want to check from time to time with a string measurement tool, so you can tension tool. There's various ones on the market. The last video in this series, I will talk about all the different types of equipment and types of tools and things that you need. But just kind of keep that in mind. You want to always have that consistency, so when customers come back to you, they kind of know what your machines are like. I know sometimes when I was stringing and I'd be at a tournament, and like it'd be the first time a player would come to you, they'd be like, so how's the machine compared to the last tournament? And of course, if the environment or the the temperature or the humidity is different, many times players will string a couple rackets to kind of see where they are, and then when it comes time to actually play, they'll they'll bring them back to you, and you'll string them, either lower or higher based on what they felt on that. So string tension is very critical. All right, next up, um, compensating for string type. Okay, so materials. Many times when you're using natural gut, for instance, you might require lower tension settings as compared to polyester strings, because if you're not going to get as much control if you string a polyester string really loose. And so many times players would prefer those being tighter. So if somebody's going from one type of string to another string, this is where that comes in play a little bit more. So what I'd like to do is, take the idea that, okay, so they're used to playing with, let's say, just a synthetic gut string at a 16 gauge, and now they're moving to a poly, and they don't have any arm problems. Well, what are you going to do? How are you going to adjust it? I generally would go up a little bit, right, with the poly, so that they get the same kind of feel. Or, on the other hand, if they want a softer feel, you might want to go down a little bit. And of course, the gauges depend. So you start learning more about this as you start experimenting with different strings and so forth. So that's always what I encourage stringers, like when they're getting started. Just try it on your own rackets, or just start experimenting. And also, the feedback from the players, like what they thought, how they liked it, and so forth. That's definitely the way to go. All right, so weaving cross strings. Okay, so basic weaving. So basically, we start talking about this is something obviously that you have to do with every racket. And the idea is, when you're you know um, installing the mains, that's a pretty straightforward. You need to obviously know where the holes are, and where the shared holes, sometimes rackets have shared holes, or where the rackets skip a hole. That's very important. And doing it efficiently and not burning the strings, meaning that you weave them too fast, and keeping that consistent. And there are tools, there are many different string tools. Of course, there's awls and pliers to help guide and pull the strings. Sometimes you'll have to cut the strings a little bit sharper, but there are some awls that you can use to actually help you pull the strings when you're weaving. And then there's actually a weaving aid that you can use. So if you're kind of new, you're just getting started, you have a little bit of trouble getting that correct, you could use a tool like that as well. Avoid friction burns. I talked about that a little bit earlier, but smooth movements, deliberate movements when pulling strings through the grommets to avoid that friction burn, because that'll obviously weaken the strings, and it will start notching. They'll start notching prematurely. You can use some wax, or whether you have a little wax stick, or generally what I used to like to use is uh, a what do you call it? Lip balm, like I'd have a little bit of that, or some a little container of Vaseline, and I just kind of put a little bit of that on there. Especially when you're stringing natural gut strings, it's pretty critical to keep that friction down. But even polyesters, try that sometime. Just kind of pull a cross string really fast over the mains, and you can feel the heat. So and you do that about 10, 20 times, and you could definitely create some damage there. So keep that in mind. All right, starting knots. Generally, there are different ways to knot the rackets, and it is important, whatever procedure that you use, that you get familiar with it and you test it out to make sure that you're not losing tension. Some people actually prefer to use a starting knot, and then work off of that as they're stringing, and then they have, of course, a tie-off knot, a finishing knot. I generally don't use a starting knot, because I will, string a few, and then I'll come back and tie off. So I use more of a traditional, but for another lesson that we can get a little bit deeper into that. And yeah, so finishing knots, there's a couple real popular ones. There's the Parnell knot, or the Wilson Pro knot, and I generally use the Wilson Pro knot. You don't want them to be too bulky or anything like that. You want to kind of be more precise when it comes to the knots, so that they're not so intrusive and that they're not so noticeable. And you want to trim them after you're done, so that you don't have a big piece of string hanging off the edge that goes, especially that goes beyond the frame. Generally, too, players sometimes will tell you, "I want you to tie off on, you know, a certain places, like 6 and 3 or whatever." They'll want certain places to you to tie off, and also make sure that the tie off um, knots are on the same side, so that you don't have one sticking up on one side of the racket and the other one is sticking up on the other side of the racket. So one's up and one's down. Some players like it a certain way, and they don't want to be able to feel that sharp point, because sometimes when you're holding your racket, you might have your hand or your finger near one of those holes. So you really want to be precise in doing this. You want to do it in such a way that the knot is long enough so that it's not going to come loose and loosen your strings that you just tightened. And you don't want it to be too long where it's going to be intrusive to any of the other strings, or possibly somebody getting, poking themselves from the sharp end of that. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Ensuring knot strength. Yeah, this is where you want to be pulling it each time securely. Double check it before you release any clamps, or make sure that you have it secure with a certain amount of pressure. Don't be afraid to pull it. Um, and over time you'll learn that a little bit. A lot of times what I'd like to do is, once I actually tied off, I would put a little mark on the string with a Sharpie, and then I could see later on if that moves at all. It's going to move a little bit, but if it moves a lot, then you know that obviously you're not doing a good job on your knots. That's just something that I like to do when I was testing that out. Inspect the string bed. So visually inspect, check the string bed for even tension, that the strings are straight. Make sure you didn't miss a weave. And this is where, players, if they see that you misweave their racket, I mean, that's like a major rookie mistake, but it happens. But you got to catch yourself on that stuff. It's sometimes easy to do if you're not paying attention when you're fully stringing. So do the touch test, kind of see how it feels, make sure it's consistent, that there's no rattles, anything loose, so forth. This is kind of like your last time to really inspect your racket before you hand it over. And yeah, like, sound it out, see if there's any vibration, so forth, like I was saying earlier. And you want to kind of be consistent and feel fresh, and make sure that you didn't cross over on any knots on the outside of the frame. Just really inspect your stringing. And you know um, confirm that the racket meets the player's needs, and that you just use the right string. I mean, generally I don't do that after the fact. I'll kind of leave that. But just, especially if you're in a shop where other people are stringing for you, sometimes you might have somebody inspect it, do like a final inspection to make sure everything is covered. And if you took in some information um, with the racket, maybe review that and make sure you have everything, especially if they wanted an overgrip, or if they wanted some head tape, or if they wanted maybe a stencil or so forth. So that way you can kind of take care of that. And document everything, service logs, keep service logs on what you did, the day that you did it. Players and customers really like that, because that way when they come back, and you like, okay, this is what we did last time, we did on this day. Oh yeah, it lasted you about 6 weeks or whatever. They like that you really care about them and their stringing, and so forth. So, and get feedback from the player, like, hey, what did you like, what could we do better, and so forth. Don't be afraid of getting the feedback, because that's kind of what it's all about. That's how you're going to get better at all that. Solicit reviews. Try to get reviews from them, so that way you can use it on your website or your other marketing materials, and it helps you be able to make any kinds of adjustments based on that feedback. So really, in summary, by mastering all these things, you end up doing a more quality string job, and you can build up your business. You continue to learn, and and excel in the profession, and so forth. So these are just some of the things to think about when you are actually doing the racket stringing, especially if you are professional racket stringer or hope to be one in the future. So once again, thanks for watching, and there are more videos in the series to come. So make sure that you like and subscribe, leave a comment. If you have a question, I am happy to answer them. Thanks. Have a great day.